What happens when prayer no longer comes from you, but through you? We usually think of prayer as an act that begins with us. We speak, we ask, we hope, and God listens. Prayer, in the modern sense, is an intentional effort, a conscious communication with the divine. But the 13th century Andalusian philosopher Ibn Arabi proposed something radically different. In true awareness, he said, the direction of prayer reverses. The divine prays through the human being. The one who prays, the act of prayer, and the one being prayed to are not separate. They are expressions of a single reality in motion. From a psychological perspective, this challenges the ordinary idea of the self as the center of will and control. What if the deepest form of prayer begins only when the ego stops claiming authorship, when awareness becomes a channel rather than an owner? At its highest level, prayer ceases to be communication. It becomes participation in divine consciousness. In psychology, prayer is often studied as a mental practice for emotional regulation. People pray to reduce uncertainty, find comfort, or regain a sense of control. Researchers call this instrumental prayer used as a coping mechanism. Neuroscientist Andrew Newberg and others have shown that during deep meditation or repetitive prayer, two areas of the brain shift dramatically. The prefrontal cortex, which governs planning and agency, quiets down, while the parietal lobe, which defines spatial boundaries, decreases in activity. The result is a temporary loss of self-father distinction, a feeling of unity or surrender. Yet for most modern practitioners, prayer remains ego-centered. It becomes a transaction. I ask, you give. The divine is positioned as a responder, not the originator. Over time, this creates a subtle form of spiritual exhaustion. People report that prayer feels mechanical, empty, or disconnected. Ibn Arabi taught that prayer loses vitality when it becomes an act of control. True prayer begins when control gives way to alignment, when the human will synchronizes with divine will rather than competing against it. Ibn Arabi, known throughout the Islamic world as Al-Shaq al-Akbarth, the greatest master, taught that all actions in existence, including prayer, are ultimately acts of the real expressing itself through creation. The human being is not the author of prayer, but the site through which divine energy becomes audible. The Quran captures this beautifully. Remember me, and I will remember you. Ibn Arabi read this not as a conversation between two entities, but as reciprocal awareness, the divine remembering itself through the human mirror. Every authentic prayer starts not in the human heart, but in divine intention awakening within consciousness. When you pray, it is the real praying through you to himself. Every motion in the universe, from a falling leaf to a whispered prayer, arises from one source. The human eye is a locus of manifestation, a point where divine will becomes visible. Ibn Arabi compared it to sunlight passing through different windows. The light remains one, though each window gives it a unique color. The same principle applies to human intention, divine energy filtered through individual form. Neuroscience offers an unexpected parallel. Benjamin Libet's experiments revealed that neural activity initiating voluntary movement begins several hundred milliseconds before conscious awareness of deciding. The body starts to act before you decide. Intention emerges first in the unseen field of divine consciousness and only later appears as personal will. When the prayer starts praying for you, it means the ego has stepped aside and the current of being flows unobstructed. For Ibn Arabi, the heart is a mirror capable of reflecting divine attributes, compassion, wisdom, beauty, justice. When covered by egoic dust, the reflection when polished through remembrance, it becomes clear. In spiritual language, this means the mirror becomes still enough for light to pass through it. In that clarity, prayer is no longer the self-addressing God, but God perceiving himself through self-aware form. The divide between subject and object collapses into unity. According to Ibn Arabi, real prayer does not rely on words, but on presence. The Quran declares, "We are closer to you than your jugular vein." The heart is the meeting point where divine will becomes feeling and form. When heart and brain rhythms sync a state called heart-brain, coherence, clarity, and intuitive insight increase. In such harmony, prayer moves beyond thought. The entire nervous system participates. The body itself joins the remembrancer silent liturgy of cells, breath, and awareness. When the prayer prays for you, your emotions, mind, and body enter resonance with a higher order of coherence. Devotion becomes less an act of will and more a state of being tuned. Ibn Arabi summarized his entire vision in one idea. Remembrance begins with God. You remember only because you are already being remembered. Prayer is not a signal you send upward, but a vibration you join, a loop of reciprocity in which divine awareness awakens itself within the human mind. When this synchronization stabilizes, the practitioner no longer performs prayer. They embody it. The human being becomes a site where divine remembrance takes form. The creator and creation are not separate substances, but relational poles of one reality. The real knows itself by reflecting through finite forms. The real prays through you, to himself, for himself. Within this circular logic, love is both the cause and the effect of prayer, the origin and the return. When a person recognizes themselves as a vessel rather than a controller, existential anxiety diminishes. Reduced self-focus corresponds with increased well-being and peace. Prayer becomes the awareness of being acting through the mind rather than the mind acting toward being. How can this vision be lived? Practice observing thoughts without trying to control them. In this stillness, intention begins to feel guided rather than manufactured. Unite prayer with steady, rhythmic breathing. This physiological surrender mirrors the spiritual one. The body learns to let prayer happen. Before prayer, clarify the purpose, not to ask, but to align. The mind stops negotiating and starts harmonizing. After prayer, briefly note moments of effortless clarity or guidance. Over time, you recognize that the most meaningful experiences arise not from effort, but from openness. Practiced consistently, these methods gradually dissolve the tension between control and surrender. Prayer evolves from ritual performance into lived awareness, the renewal of creation at every instant. So what truly happens when the prayer starts praying for you? It means the illusion of separation ends. The human being no longer prays to God as an external listener, but as a mirror through which divine awareness contemplates itself. The self is not an isolated entity. It is a reflective process in a greater field of being. Prayer is not a message sent outward, but synchronization with that field. Consciousness is relational, a network of interactions between brain, body, and environment. Awareness is not a private container, but an emergent pattern of connection. Remembrance is never once. You remember because the real remembers through you. When that insight matures, prayer transforms. It becomes less about seeking outcomes and more about revealing presence, less about words and more about silent understanding. You do not remember God so that he may notice you. You remember because you are already being remembered. In that recognition, prayer moves from effort to ease, from speech to stillness, from striving to being. That is Ibn Arabi's divine twist, the moment when the human voice falls silent, and the divine continues the prayer through the heart that finally learned to listen.